Hi, I'm Will Fields, and I've been a commercial photographer for over 40 years. But my primary love of photography has always been nature and landscape photos. About 10 years ago, I just moved from Chicago to a smaller town and been there about 3 weeks, had just gotten my email address changed, and I get an email from a lady that I've never heard of. Turns out she just bought a really expensive new camera, and she asked if I'd be willing to give her a lesson. Wasn't a whole lot going on in the first 3 weeks, so off we went. We did the lesson and it worked really well. She was happy, I was happy, we got along, worked really well, and went home. About 3 days later, I get an email from her best friend who just bought the exact same camera. Went and did the same lesson. Went well. She had a friend who had a friend, and about 10 people down the line, a Groupon sales lady showed up, and that was the beginning of Studio 315 photo workshops, and we've been doing it ever since. During that time, I've developed other classes, actually written curriculum for things to do, and lesson plans, and have begun teaching at the local botanical garden as well as going to other cities, state and national parks, helping people grow their photography. And since then, we've had about 4,000 people attend classes. A great many of them have been through multiple classes again and again. But today, we're here to put all that behind us and start where we began. Today we're going to teach you how to take your camera and move beyond auto. I like using quotes. Don't know why, I just love using quotes. And one of my absolute favorites is by a French photographer named Henri Cartier-Bresson, whose quote was, "Your first 10,000 photographs are your worst." Henri began photographing in the early 1930s after studying some art, and he was really one of the absolute pioneers of what we call today street photography. I recommend you look up his work and the work of any other masters, or just Google famous photographers. The more you look, the more you study, the more you're going to learn. So grab your camera and let's get to work. First, let's assume that you already know how to charge the battery and put it in, and how to put the memory card in and format it. Let's just assume that that's with us. I've brought 3 different cameras with me, and we're going to concentrate primarily on Canon and Nikon. They're what represent most of the digital cameras that are being used today. Now, these aren't the newest models, and some of their buttons and controls may not be in the exact same place as yours. But you should be able to find the controls just by watching and figuring things out. Ultimately, it'll all work out to basically the same thing, it's just the little controls will be here and there a little different. This Canon is an entry-level camera and represents what most beginners own. The Nikon is a mid-level camera and has some more advanced features. It's not what you would call a truly professional camera, but it's getting close. So what it has is a great deal of more buttons that make things faster once you learn how to use them. For this program, what I recommend we do, and what I recommend you do for most of your practice, is we're going to turn our camera to the aperture priority mode. On Nikon, that's A, and on Canon, it's AV. It's the big knob here on top. Just turn, and we're on AV mode. We'll discuss what aperture priority means later on. The first control I want to talk about is the shutter button. But let's take off our lens cap and get ready. My kids are in their 20s and they still love it, still find it funny when I forget to take my lens cap off. So the shutter button does a great deal more than just cause the camera to take a picture. You really need to get used to using it, and don't worry about wearing it out. That's what it's for. Just keep pushing on it. It actually operates as a secondary switch. Touch it and it lights up the rear display. Push it halfway down and it operates the autofocus. Get used to touching the shutter button. Get used to working with it. It's basically going to just become second nature. The next thing that we want to talk about is your lens. Now this is just a standard kit lens that comes on most basic cameras, but you'll see that there are numbers on the barrel. These numbers represent the focal length of the lens, and it's measured in millimeters. You see that it just moves quite easily back and forth. This particular zoom has a range of 18 to 55 millimeters. And what that means is it goes from a fairly wide angle zoom up to a very short telephoto. Or simply put, wide angle takes in more of the scene, whereas a telephoto gives you a much more narrow angle and brings you closer to the subject. It does a lot more than that, but all of that's for another day. We'll move along to it in the next lesson. On the rear of your lens, over here, you'll see two switches. The other switch, the first one, is for your autofocus. See the little AF, MF? It's not any sort of obscenity. It's autofocus and manual focus. And if for any reason you ever get to the point that you want to focus manually, click it over. But mostly I recommend you leave it on autofocus. And if you're ever shooting and you suddenly lose autofocus, all at once your autofocus isn't working, check the little button. See if it just got hit by accident. You never know. And that's the quickest fix. The next button on the rear is the image stabilizer. There are reasons once you advance to occasionally turn it off, but for the most part, just leave it on. So Canon, first touch your shutter button, and then look at the back and touch the button marked Q. It'll be in different places on different cameras, but Q allows you to toggle to all of the controls that you need to adjust the camera. So first, let's set ISO. You do that by pressing Set and then advance to where you want to be. For today, let's set it to 3200. That's way higher than you'd normally use, but for today, it'll do what we need to do. So we set it to 3200. Let's set it again. Let's go back to 100, set, and go back again and set it to 3200. I'm a big believer in repetition. The more you remember it, the more you'll remember where it is when you need it. And it's always when you're in a hurry, when you're trying to grab that important shot, that you have trouble remembering where it is. Our next button takes us to, see the little light bulb? Hit that. It sets white balance. Currently, it's set for tungsten light. You can do fluorescent, flash, custom. Do yourself a favor and stay away from custom for quite a while. Auto white balance. I used to think that auto white balance was a serious negative, but as things have changed, it can really be your friend. And the thing that, whoops, you see how that shut off? Touch the shutter button again, touch Q again, go in, and it's there. Where we shoot normally when we're outside is set to daylight. That's what we're going to set it for today. But let's do repetition again. Let's go to tungsten, set, and then back to daylight, set. Now, let's set the aperture, and you'll see that this changes on the camera. Let's set the and you do it by, when you're on AV mode, you do it by turning this little wheel. See how it changes? And if we touch the shutter button, you'll see that this is the shutter speed. And every time you change the f-stop, you change the shutter speed. They're interconnected. Every time one goes one click up, the other goes one click down. They're part of the exposure triangle, and we'll get into that a whole nother day. On this Nikon, more advanced, let's take the lens off, you'll see that it has a front wheel and a rear wheel. They both operate different portions. But if you press info, your back lights up and you can set things like ISO. ISO is set with the rear wheel. You can see it changing. This camera runs from 100 ISO all the way up to 25,600. It's an amazing technological thing. And the even newer cameras, such as the new Sonys, go as high as 200,000 ISO. Life is just getting better and better. What we want to do in practicing, and really the way I recommend shooting when you're practicing, is to use your center spot for focus. Touch the shutter button, touch this little tiny magnifying glass, the button there, and it takes you to the autofocus point selection. You can toggle around and get to manual selection. Once you do that, you can choose any one you want, but I really recommend the center focus spot for a couple of reasons. The first is the center focus spot is the let's look at it, is the strongest sensor, the strongest autofocus sensor in the camera. Additionally, we're going to use it in the way we shoot, but we'll get to that later. With the Nikon, it's actually a little more difficult. Touch info. There's a little button up here in the front. You push it and you adjust your autofocus area with the front dial. Where we want to be on it is the little center focus, and that takes you to just the center dot. So after we set the dot, there are three, count them, three, autofocus modes in both of these cameras. For our intents and purposes, and for quite a while until you get truly advanced, you're really only going to use two of them. The first is single shot. The way you do that on the Canon, touch your shutter button, hit your Q, and you toggle down to here where it says AI servo. Your choices are AI servo, AI focus, and one shot. What we want to do today is one shot. We set that and we leave it. With the Nikon, again, we've got this same little button. Touch it, touch info, touch it, and with the rear dial, you can switch between AFA, which is automatic. Again, stay away from that one. AFC, which is autofocus continuous, and AFS. AFS is going to be our buddy, and it's what we're going to work with today. So let's leave it there, and it's simply set. You can see how a more advanced camera makes things a little easier to switch everything. But by the same token, it's kind of like driving a manual shift car. You've got to learn where the buttons are and how to move things. Something else, just a little item to make your life a little easier is, and I'll show it on the Canon, right here by the viewfinder, there's this little tiny wheel. It's called the diopter, and what it's for is quite simply adjusting the viewfinder to your eyes. Whether you wear glasses, whether you don't wear glasses, whatever, it's kind of like going to the eye doctor. You just focus on something, and once it's focused, without moving, you turn the little dial back and forth until the picture is as sharp as you can get it. Better, better, worse, worse, 6:2, just like the eye doctor. That's what it's there for. It doesn't change the photo in any way. It's just there for your eye. The first time I show this to a lot of people, they're like, I've always wondered why the picture was out of focus when I looked at it, but then once I took the picture, it was in focus. The answer was the diopter was set entirely wrong for their eye. The other two buttons that I want to mention are first, the review button. I bet everybody knows this already. This little tiny blue arrow button. Touch your shutter button, push it, and a picture comes up. Not a very good one, but a picture. It's the exact same on the Nikon. It's just in a different place. Little tiny arrow, and a picture comes up. You can see that this camera's on the center dot. So, we bring up a photo, and once it's there, touch the magnify button, and it zooms in as much as you want. The purpose of this, more than anything else, is so you can check focus. Is my picture in focus where I want it to be or not? You can then back it back out with the other button, the negative magnify, and take it so that you can see basically every picture on the camera, or just hit your review button and it goes back to normal. Quick and easy, nothing to it, right? So we've got all those little controls down, but we still have no idea what they mean. Well, let's get down to it. Photography is the momentary recording of light. Without light, there is no vision. Without vision, there is no photography. Without light, there is no photography. And that amount of light that reaches onto your camera's sensor or onto film is what's referred to as the exposure. The exposure is made up of three parts. First, the ISO, and we'll get into that first in a second. Second, the aperture. And lastly, the shutter speed. Let's get into them. ISO refers to how sensitive your sensor is to light. It can be ranged from, like I showed you, 100 up to 200,000 ISO. In the old days of film, back when I was first started, back in the days of dinosaurs and the whole bit, 400 ISO film was considered pretty hot stuff. It was a big deal. And then they went to 800 and went all the way up to, wow, 1600 ISO film. And the film, let's face it, it looked bad. It had what was then called grain, which kind of looked like little sand pebbles or maybe even marbles on the 1600 film. But you just lived with it because you actually got a picture in the dark. Today, we can basically go and shoot bats in a cave. And the future's only going to get bigger. But the best way to think of ISO is kind of like your car radio. It's pretty simple. When you want more sound on your car radio, you just turn up the volume, right? Nothing to it. Turn up the volume, you get more sound. With ISO, you need more light, you turn up the ISO. Easy, does a really good job, but the downside to it is what's referred to as noise. Just like your car radio, if you turn it up too loud, begins to distort, your speakers are blaring, you can't hear it, it's fuzzy, it's bad. That's noise on your ISO. So you want to be careful to shoot with the lowest ISO you can because of quality, but by the same token, a fuzzy picture is way better than no picture. That's ISO. Aperture. Really simple. I brought in this lens for two reasons. The first is to be able to show you an actual demonstration of aperture. The other is to show you that it's been dropped and is broken. These things are not bounce friendly. You want to be careful. But if you can see through here, you'll see that as you operate the little lever that your camera does, it opens and closes a little multi-bladed shutter inside the lens. That controls the amount of light that comes through the lens. And that amount of light that comes through is measured in what's called f-stops. Now, f-stops, to be honest, f-stops and aperture have kind of become synonymous anymore, but they aren't actually the same thing. But for our intents and purposes, let's go with synonymous. The next thing to think about is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time that the light is allowed to flow through your lens, through the aperture, onto the sensor of your camera. It's that simple. It's a timed amount that allows light onto the sensor. The more time, the more light. Now, most cameras today, this Canon included, will do its own exposure from 30 seconds up to 1/4000th of a second. 30 seconds, and anything that moves on Earth will begin to blur. 1/4000th of a second, if you can trigger it, and they sell devices that you can use, will stop a bullet in flight in the image. Don't actually try to stop a bullet. But that is shutter speed. And it's really simple. Let's use the Nikon for this one. It ranges from a really fast exposure to something really slow. This is 3 seconds. And it all varies as part of the exposure. We'll get into how you decide which is which in another show. But at least now you know what they do. Now let's talk about white balance. White balance is really simple. It's just made to sound confusing. Real quick, if the radiation that hits the Earth is, let's say, a spectrum this long, the amount that we see as light is probably about this long. And when we're looking at light, just like we're looking at anything, we don't actually see with our eyes. Our eyes are pretty much just lenses, kind of like a camera lens. In fact, that's ultimately where the idea for the camera lens came from. But what we do see with, is our brains. And the human brain is incredibly adaptable. We can quickly learn to deal with just about anything. When we see the sun setting or rising, we understand that it's red. Well, the sun isn't red. The sun is the same color as when it's directly overhead on a good, clear, blue sky day. It's basically what's referred to as white light. And no matter where the Earth is spinning, the sun stays the same color, right? But our cameras don't know that. So, for example, if you're using auto white balance knows that when it sees the sun, the little brain inside your camera can recognize the sun. And it will say, oh, the sun isn't red, the sun is white. And it will do everything it can do to get rid of those really nice colors that you think you're taking a picture of. You get home and you're like, what happened? You were on auto white balance. Typically, when we're outside, it's best to have your white balance set, and we already showed how to set it, but it's best to set your white balance on daylight, or in Nikon-E's, direct sunlight. Typically, that's where we want to shoot when we're outside. As you progress, you'll want to experiment and do other things. So what we do is decide to tell our camera how to control this light. Whether it's the yellow of an incandescent light bulb, or the green of a fluorescent light, or the absolute best example, and this is where auto has become such a friend, is a high school gym. If you've ever been in a high school gym for, let's say, the violin recital and tried to take pictures, typically a high school gym has 4 different types of lights on, and they're all a different color. So the best thing to do there, unless you're kind of like me and you need to control everything, is turn to auto white balance. Will it be exactly perfect? No, but it'll be awfully close. You really won't notice the difference unless you put it next to something that's perfectly white balanced. So don't be afraid of auto white balance, but when you go outside, turn it off. Now, we were talking about focus modes. Basically, there are 2 types of focus that we use. There is single focus. Let's go here. So you hold the shutter button down and it focuses. You heard it. And as long as you keep your finger on that button, it will stay in the same focus. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, let's say you want to take a picture of, like, a shot of this girl on the hay. You want her face in focus and the background out of focus, but you don't want her face in the very center. So what you do is focus on her face and then recompose the image, moving the center dot to where you want it to be. And then once you're ready and composed, then you take the picture. That's the entire purpose of choosing your focus point. And to be honest, choosing your focus point is just about the most important portion of the taking of a photo. It's where you begin to make the difference in taking pictures and making photos. Focus point and then compose. And I really want it to become that way in your brain. 2 steps. Focus point, then compose. It'll serve you really well no matter what you're doing. The other type of focus is constant, and that is, let's show it on the Canon. Touch the button, touch the cue, and where it says 1 shot, push set, move over to AI servo. Again, stay off of AI focus. It's not your buddy yet. But when you do that, anywhere that you put the center dot of the camera, it will remain in focus. So, a good example is you're shooting a soccer game. Just put the dot on the subject that you want in focus, and no matter where they run, back, forth, up, down, close, far away, they'll remain in focus. And knowing how to switch between the 2 is really important. So if you had problems with that, back up, review that section, and get where you can switch back and forth pretty quickly. So, aperture priority. Aperture priority is quite simply where you set the f-stop and the ISO, and the camera sets the shutter speed. It's quick, it's easy, And since ultimately the f-stop, and we're going to get into that in a minute, is a highly effective way of controlling the focus in your camera, it's what you want to use for the majority of what you do. If you're shooting sports, you might want to change to shutter priority. A good way to show is with Nikon, aperture priority is A, shutter priority is S. It's that simple. Now, I don't know who wrote the first manual for digital cameras, but whoever it was, the other guy got a hold of it and changed every possible word that he could. So, aperture priority on Canon is AV, whereas shutter priority is TV, Thomas Victor. Why? I don't know. I don't know if it's a bad translation. I don't know, but it is. Just live with it. And now we get into what is ultimately sort of the whole crux of why we use apertures and f-stops. While it does control the amount of light that comes through your camera, it also controls what is referred to as depth of field. And depth of field is the area in front of and behind your point of focus that remains in focus. As an example, if we were using this Nikon to take a photo of the Canon, our depth of field would be in front of and behind the point of focus if we focused on the camera. The larger the f-stop number, the bigger the depth of field. The smaller the f-stop number, the smaller the depth of field. It's very simple. You've wondered how people do shots of, for example, people where the background is out of focus but the person's absolutely clear? It's depth of field and using a small f-stop number. It's really easy to get confused by the fact that the smaller the f-stop number, the larger the aperture opening. Don't worry about it. Don't think about it. Don't let it confuse you. Put that away and just remember small number, small depth of field, big number, big depth of field. In essence, you're buying focus with your f-stops. Just need a little focus, just buy a little. Need a lot of focus, buy a bunch. But with all of this, it's just like everything else. It's practice. And I'll give you what has come to be known as my famous saxophone talk. So there are a lot of people that own really expensive saxophones all over the world. And some of them keep them in their closet and they take them out once a year, wet up the reed, they play glowworm, they're tickled to death, they put their saxophone away, and they're done for a year. Now, there are no saxophone police. Nobody comes in, kicks your door in, and says, hey, why aren't you practicing? It all fits in with what makes you happy and what fits in with your life. The same as with photography. There are no photo police. They aren't going to come in and say, hey, you aren't practicing, you aren't doing this, what's going on? It's all what fits in with your life and how you enjoy it and what you have time for. Don't feel guilty, and remember that photography is not a competitive sport. The only one you're competing with in photography is yourself. So don't worry. With practice, it all makes sense, and the more you practice, the better you get. I would recommend, again, looking at other photographers' work. There are share sites online. There are probably 10 or 15 of them. Go look at what other people are doing. See what excites you, see what interests you. Photograph what you enjoy. Don't turn it into work. Make it something you love. And let me leave you with one of what's always been the most sobering quotes that I've ever dealt with in photography. It's from a guy named Edward Weston. Edward Weston is considered one of the absolute premier photographers in the history of photography. And he worked in a time where they used the view cameras, you know, the big things that you had to move and put the cloth over your head. Edward did a lot of work. And his quote is, "If I have any message worth giving to a beginner, it's that there are no shortcuts in photography." It's true, you gotta work to learn. So, if you have any questions, if anything comes up, I'm happy to receive emails, and I'll answer every question I can. It can take me a week to get back to you, but I promise I will get back to you. Hi, I'm Will Fields, and I've been a commercial photographer for over 40 years. But my primary love of photography has always been nature and landscape photos. Hi, I'm Will Fields, and welcome back to Move Beyond Auto. Previously, we were working on learning to operate the controls of your digital camera, but today we're going to take that a little bit further. I'd like to review a couple of the concepts that we were talking about before we go any further, and if for some reason they don't make sense to you, please go back and review, because going on after this, you're really going to need to know those concepts. What we're going to do is learn to move beyond just taking pictures, which is really just using your camera as you would any point and shoot, and go into learning to make photos where you actually use the sophistication of your camera to create the images that you want to make. That's really the difference in what we're trying to do here. That's not to say that everybody watching this is supposed to become one of the great masters of photography. It does mean that you get out of this what you put into it. Simply buying equipment can up your game, but until you really learn how to use it, mostly what it is a lot of really expensive, heavy stuff that you need to lug around. Just owning the equipment doesn't make you a photographer. There's an old story about a famous photographer going to a very wealthy woman's house for a dinner party. And as he came in, she very politely said, "Oh, I love your work. You must have an incredible camera." And he thanked her and went but as he was leaving, he said, "You know, dinner was wonderful. I think you really must have an incredible stove." Yeah, I think the point of that story is pretty straightforward. I think you get it. I want to do a quick review of a few basic settings that we've already talked about. And the first of that is that there are two modes of autofocus that we're working with. The first is single shot lock, or what in Canon is called one shot. In Nikon is called AFS. And for most of the other brands, it's something similar to one of the others. Single focus is when you lock focus on your point, and as long as you hold the little button down, your shutter button down, it stays locked on that focus and you can recompose. When you're practicing, for the most part, I'd really like you to use that. The other is constant focus, and that's where, as long as you're holding the shutter button down, whatever you have the little center dot set on, that's what's going to stay on focus. A good example would be a soccer game, running up and down, back and forth. As long as that dot's on your subject, it's in focus, and it can do a much better job than you can. The other thing that we're talking about is primarily we shoot in, for practice, I'd like you to shoot in aperture priority, which in Nikon is A, in Canon is AV. We went into that before. When you're practicing, please use aperture mode. Shutter priority, which is S on Nikon, and TV on Canon, I still don't understand that one, is really for when you want to control how much blur or freezing of motion is in. So if you need to get into something like high speed or an animal running, that sort of thing, you might want to consider shutter mode, but for most of the time when you're practicing, please stay in aperture priority. Last thing, the most important thing that we want to talk about is depth of field. Depth of field and controlling what is and isn't in focus within your image is probably the single most important element of what you control. Depth of field, learn it, stay with it, keep working. It's something you'll use the rest of the time that you do photography. If any of this doesn't make sense or you don't understand, please go back and review. There will be a YouTube listing on the end to get you back to where you can watch this on your own time. So the first is choosing which metering mode or light metering mode that you're going to use while you're working with your camera. There are between 3 and some cameras 5 different modes of light metering, and while each has an advantage, what we're really working with today is what's going to work for you best all around for the time being. Usually, it will either be measured with a little button here at the top where you push and then select the choices, full matrix, spot, or center weighted metering. Center weighted is what we're generally going to try and use for the time being. If it isn't a little button, it's on your screen and you'll see it here. Or you can go to multi, center, standard spot, entire average screen, and highlight. So there are a lot of variations, but like I said, let's stay with center weighted metering. As you progress, I'm sure you're going to want to learn to play with the others, experiment and see how they work. It's a good idea, but for the time being, don't let it concern you. Just stay with center weighted. Next is exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is what allows you to tell your camera if you want the picture to be a little bit lighter or a little bit darker, or actually a fair amount lighter or a fair amount darker. It isn't just a little amount. But if aperture priority is using your camera in semi-manual mode, exposure compensation is pretty much the same as you shifting the gears on an automatic transmission. It just gets you exactly where you want to be. The way that it generally works, and again, we'll look at the Nikon, bring this up. There's a little button, almost like a yin-yang button, that is usually on the top, but sometimes the back. It gets you there, and you can dial to plus or to minus. And that will make things lighter and darker. On the Sony, it's actually much simpler. You've got a dial here on top. It's really quick, really easy, and about as visual as it gets. You just dial back and forth. Now, there are situations where you use exposure compensation that are, it's pretty easy to grasp. Think about a person that's backlit with the sun behind them. You take the picture and it comes out kind of dark on their face. Basically, the whole front of the picture is dark. So you dial in very simply. Let's go to a plus, say plus 1 1/3. It's just a good guess. You don't really know until you see it, but you do it, take your picture, and it should lighten the photo to where you want to be. If it doesn't, experiment a little more one way or the other, and get it to where you want to be. Sometimes you have to take 4 or 5 shots to get the one you want, right? We all know that. Make certain that once you've finished, you set it back to 0. If you don't, your photos are going to stay either that lighter or that much darker for the rest of the time you're shooting. The other thing is really pay attention to it, especially in situations where you've got your little button, although also with a dial like this. It's really easy to hit exposure compensation and not know it. So if you're shooting along and you look down just to double check and everything is suddenly dark or light, check exposure compensation. It's probably gotten moved and you didn't know it. Just something to be aware of, and that'll do it. The last control to talk about today is drive mode. Drive mode's pretty simple. It's a question of whether you take one shot or ten. So we go into our display mode, go to drive mode, and choose back and forth. Are we going to single? Are we going to multi-exposure? Or are we going to timer, self-timer? So you can push the button and then run getting the picture yourself. There are all sorts of things you can do. Also, just as a little side hint to remember, if you're ever out shooting on a tripod and you've forgotten the remote for your camera, you can always set the self-timer so that you touch it and then it gives it 10 seconds, 2 seconds, or whatever you're set to settle before it takes the exposure, and you don't get that tripod shake from your finger on the button. Just a little tip. So, enough about how to physically control a camera. I think it's always important to remember the most important part of the camera is the 12 inches behind the viewfinder. In other words, your head. So on to today's quote. Love them quotes. And that is, there is nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept. And what that really means is clarify your message. Photos communicate. Good photos communicate well. And what it comes down to is this. Photography is communication. We all agree on that. And just like learning to write, learning to speak, we have to learn proper grammar, we have to learn how to control things, we have to learn how to edit. I mean, isn't one really good sentence better than 2 really bad paragraphs if you're trying to get a concept across? Really work on getting the idea of what it is that you want to shoot, what it is you want to create. We talk about composition and lighting and framing, and each of those are really important. They really are. And we'll get around to those on another day. But what's more important than all of these is stopping and looking at your subject before you raise your camera, before you look through the viewfinder. Stop and ask yourself these 2 questions. And it's probably better, don't ask them out loud unless you're out by yourself and nobody's close by. So, question 1, what is the message of this photo? What am I trying to say? What am I attempting to talk about? And question 2, what's the best way to communicate this message? How is it that I can best sum this up in one good sentence? Think before you shoot. The whole thing has to do with your thought, not just what you see. As you get faster, as you get more adept, the longer you shoot, this will happen more quickly. But if you need to sit down and look at a subject for 15 minutes before you go after it, take your time. It'll pay off in the quality of your image. Once you have that concept of what you want, that's when you look through the viewfinder and begin to explore the image that you want to create. Photographs are successful when the message is clear. When the message is ambiguous or cloudy or fuzzy, the photos just generally aren't a keeper. If they didn't think about what they were doing, it generally doesn't happen. Most really good photographers have studied the concepts of two-dimensional design, at least in passing, and some even in color. And learning the rules really gives you a good understanding of where to start, of how to approach composition. But when you get right down to it, for every rule of two-dimensional composition or two-dimensional color, I can show you 10 great photographs that break that rule. So understanding it is a good way to start and a good way to learn how to break the rules, but they're really not the most important part. Ansel Adams once said, "There are no rules for good photographs, there are only good photographs." But using rules of thumb are a good place to start. So at this stage, let's just really start with the absolute basics. Number one, fill the frame. If your lens or a fence or traffic won't let you get close enough, you can always crop the image when you get home. Don't get into the habit of, "I'll fix it later." It only leads to really sloppy shooting and trouble on down the line. Get the absolute best filled frame you can every time you shoot. And the other, and really this is what it's all about, is it's all about the light. All of it. Ultimately, without light there is no vision. Without light there is no photography. And photography is the momentary recording of existing light. Learn to study light, learn to pay attention to it. The best image with the worst light is really still going to be a pretty mediocre image. Let's close with my last quote of the day, which is, "The important thing is not the camera, but the eye." The camera is just a tool. We've talked about that before. It's the saxophone. And the more you play the saxophone, the better you get. But it's actually what's going on inside your mind that creates the image. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to reply to any question. It may take me a week, but I promise I will get back to you. And if you've enjoyed this, please subscribe to the YouTube channel that will be listed here at the bottom. And please follow my Instagram page. It helps pay the bills and helps us keep doing these things. So hopefully we can help you a little more. Thanks for being here. I'm Will Fields, and I'm with Studio 315 Photo Workshops.